There was comfort in the Quran, and he was allowed to stay here in his private apartments, with their beautiful view made infinitely more so by the great monument which he himself had created to his wife, and to happier days, when she was alive and their sons were busy only with nursery battles, instead of the fight to the death on which they would now embark.
Learning the words of the Holy Book by heart, in many societies the basis of religious education. These are children in a mosque in India. This kind of learning is seen as instilling two virtues, knowledge of the Quran and a sense of discipline. Adults now in the mosque at Lahore. The sense of discipline in a shared belief and cause strikes anyone who attends the Friday service in a mosque. It was a mood which would be put to political use by the last of the Great Moghuls, Aurangzeb. Aurangzeb was unusual among the Great Moghuls in being painted kneeling at his prayers. His ancestors had preferred not to draw attention to any being superior to themselves, but he saw himself as a humble warrior in the service of Islam. The word means submission to the will of God. When Aurangzeb was a young man, many Muslims in India felt a sense of grievance against his family. The Moghul Empire had been stabilized largely by involving the Hindus. Under Aurangzeb, the frontiers would be vastly extended, and he himself would spend much of his life fighting in the south. But his most passionate aim was to turn India into a more orthodox Islamic state. Violence between the two great communities of India, Hindus and Muslims, is nothing new. The tragic events of 1947, when India and Pakistan became independent countries, were merely the most extreme example. The question of how far the ruling Muslim minority should tolerate the pagan practices of the Hindus was an important one in Aurangzeb's youth, when he was just one of several rival princes. The natural heir to the throne, Dara Shikoh, profoundly disagreed with his younger brother Aurangzeb. He believed in encouraging all religions equally, which Aurangzeb considered heresy. The Quran gives clear guidance. Muslims must allow Jews and Christians to worship freely, but should place restrictions on other religions. It had been Mughal policy to lift these restrictions from the Hindus, but this offended the more orthodox in the Muslim community. It was this indignation, felt by many of the Muslims, which Aurangzeb would use in his struggle for the throne. His family had betrayed the faithful. He would defend the faith. There were three people with cause for complaint when Aurangzeb declared himself emperor in 1658. One was his father, Shah Jahan, the rightful emperor, whom Aurangzeb had captured and imprisoned. Another was Dara Shikoh, Shah Jahan's favorite and his intended heir. And then there was a younger brother, Murad Bakhsh, whom Aurangzeb had once proclaimed as the prince who should succeed, instead of the heretic Dara Shikoh. When it finally came to a pitched battle, Dara Shikoh was defeated by the combined armies of his younger brothers. And from that moment, Aurangzeb, seen here in green, systematically set about removing each of these three living obstacles to his own rule. His immediate concern was his elder brother. Dara Shikoh had fled from the battlefield on his elephant. With his father's blessing, he had then ridden fast to seize the imperial treasure. The intention was to buy himself another army with which to fight Aurangzeb. The first stop was Shah Jahan's new fort at Delhi. Here there was great wealth, but Aurangzeb was hard on his heels. The same thing in Lahore, again vast treasure, again no time to transform it into trained soldiers. After 6 months in remote places, Dara Shikoh did at last return with an army, and the two rivals confronted each other in the hills surrounding the town of Ajmer, some 300 miles south of Lahore.
These marble pavilions by the lake at Ajmer were built for Shah Jahan, two of whose sons were now fighting their final battle a few miles away. And on the day of that battle, there could be seen here a strange assembly of elephants, women and children, eunuchs, all nervously waiting. They were Dara Shikoh's harem with the remains of his treasure. They were ready to set off at a moment's notice because he'd told them that if he lost the battle, he would join them here so that they could flee together into the desert to escape his murderous brother. Well, he did lose the battle, and in the chaos he managed to miss even this vital rendezvous. The women and the eunuchs waited here as long as they could, and then fled without him. Miraculously, they managed to join up with him a few weeks later, but ahead lay an ultimate betrayal. Shah Jahan had sentenced a local ruler to be trampled to death by elephants, and Dara Shikoh had saved the man's life, pleading the special influence of a favorite son to ask for pardon. Now surely was the time to call in old debts. Dara and his family arrived in the man's territory. For a few days, they were royally entertained. And then, most treacherously, Dara Shikoh and his 15-year-old son were seized. The ruler had decided where his best advantage lay.
An elephant set off north with a closed howdah, bearing Dara Shikoh and his young son as prisoners. Their destination, Delhi and Aurangzeb. Today's old town in Delhi was then new. It had been recently built, close to the Red Fort by Shah Jahan. It was here that Aurangzeb now organized a charade to humiliate his elder brother. It very nearly misfired. At this sort of height above the street, Dara Shikoh and his young son were paraded through Old Delhi. They were dressed in rags, smeared with dirt, and seated on a skinny female elephant. The people of Delhi were supposed to jeer, but they didn't. Dara Shikoh had been a generous and popular prince. There was resentment at his humiliation, and that gave added urgency to the next stage of Aurangzeb's plan. Learned and holy men play an important part in the legal system of Islam, and Aurangzeb now set up a committee of such people to advise on the fate of his brother, whom he described as the chief of the atheists. The holy men, after due consideration, recommended death. Aurangzeb then let it be known that he himself would have preferred exile for his brother, but he bowed to religious authority, and the deed was soon done. Next in line was the younger brother, Murad Bakhsh, who had once been Aurangzeb's ally but now found himself his prisoner. Aurangzeb kept him in the impregnable fortress of Gwalior.
He had captured him by a ruse which violated not only brotherly ties, but even the laws of hospitality. Aurangzeb had invited Murad to dine in his tent at a time when they were still allies. Aurangzeb himself was much too pious a Muslim to touch alcohol, but there was plenty of wine for Murad. And afterwards, Aurangzeb suggested a soothing massage from a beautiful slave girl. Murad fell asleep, knowing that his own guard was standing watch over him to warn of any danger. But the guard was cleverly distracted for a moment and was silently strangled. Murad awoke to find himself a prisoner.
That same night, 4 elephants set off from Aurangzeb's camp in 4 different directions. Each carried a closed howdah, making it hard for any rescue party to decide which to pursue. The one with Murad Bakhsh inside delivered him to a succession of prisons, and eventually to the dark security of Gwalior.
It was not enough for Aurangzeb to keep Murad prisoner, however secure he might be deep in the dungeons at Gwalior. He wanted him dead. And he achieved that by a piece of hypocrisy that was typical of the man. Murad had once had a man murdered, and that gave Aurangzeb his chance. Under Muslim law, only the relatives of the murdered man can demand justice. Aurangzeb now sought out those relatives. The eldest son refused to take action, but the second son was persuaded to bring a case, and the judge found Murad guilty. The second son could still have accepted money for his father's life, but with due prompting, he refused any payment, which left only death as the penalty. Aurangzeb, apparently with the deepest regret, said that the law was the law, and the guilty man must die even if he did happen to be the emperor's brother. But to emphasize his own personal distaste for vindictiveness, he rewarded not the second son, but the eldest one, for refusing to indulge in vendetta.
Only one man living could now deny Aurangzeb's claim to the throne, the prisoner in the Red Fort at Agra, Shah Jahan. Even Aurangzeb couldn't kill his father. He left that to time, and after 8 years, the old man died.
A boat brought him to his final reunion. For 8 years he had gazed from his marble cell at his most astonishing creation, and never once been allowed to visit his wife's tomb. Now his body was brought the mile or so down the river from the fort to the Taj, to lie once again beside Mumtaz Mahal, beneath the very center of that superb dome.
For the Hindu majority, Aurangzeb's firm hold on the throne was unwelcome news. The Quran says that unbelievers must pay a special tax. Aurangzeb's great-grandfather, Akbar, had freed them from this, in the tolerant mood of which Aurangzeb so strongly disapproved. Aurangzeb, having less interest in communal harmony, now reintroduced the much-hated tax. It was in the ancient and powerful Hindu city of Jodhpur that opposition to Aurangzeb first came to a head. Above the marketplace, there towers one of the most spectacular forts of Rajasthan. The family holding this fort had been closely allied with the Moguls ever since the time of Akbar. Now they became restless, and Aurangzeb sent his favorite son, also called Akbar, with a large army to bring this place under control. But the Jodhpur royal family made most tempting proposals to the young prince. His bigoted father, they said, was tearing the empire apart. What India needed was a broad-minded Moghul emperor, like the great Akbar, whose name the prince shared. If their Rajput army, they suggested, were combined with his Moghul army, they could together overthrow his father and place a new Akbar on the throne. The Rajputs were famous fighters. The plot seemed a good one. The prince agreed to join them. For Aurangzeb, it was a most dangerous moment. He happened to be not far away, but he was directing a much smaller force from his red imperial tent.
Only the emperor used a red tent, and in effect it's a version in canvas and embroidery of the white marble columns and arches among which he would hold private audience when at home in a palace. This is in the museum in Jodhpur Fort, and is the only one of its kind to have survived. But as Aurangzeb sat in his tent, he was aware that this time he would only be saved by his own genius for deception. He set to work. He knew that his son would not march into battle except on a day approved by his astrologers. Well, naturally, Aurangzeb had spies in his son's camp, and they now bribed the astrologers to look into their charts and to find there that, to be absolutely certain of good luck, a little delay was advisable. That delay gave Aurangzeb time to bring up more troops. Even so, he couldn't match the combined force of his son's army and the Rajputs, but he had another age-old trick up his sleeve. As the opposing armies moved closer, with battle almost certain on the next day, Aurangzeb wrote a letter to his son, congratulating him on the brilliant way in which he had brought such a large Rajput army into the trap which they had together prepared for them. The letter was smuggled into his son's camp, and it was arranged for it to fall into Rajput hands. Overnight, the Rajput army vanished, and when that was discovered, young Akbar fled as well. His father was not the man to be so easily toppled.
The area into which Akbar headed was the wild mountainous region south of the Moghul Empire, known as the Deccan. This was the part of India which successive Moghul emperors had found most difficult to subdue. The reason was simple, but not simple enough to deter Aurangzeb. This was perfect terrain for any guerrilla force, striking unexpectedly at a conventional army and then vanishing. And during Aurangzeb's reign, a ruler had emerged here who was a classic leader of guerrillas. His statue can be found today in many Indian towns, because he became, in our own century, a symbol of how Hindus could drive out oppressors, by implication the British. His name was Shivaji, and his successes, according to one Indian historian, proved that the Hindu race can build a nation. The countryside inland from Bombay is dotted with forts, which Shivaji captured and held, such as this one at Panhala.
This dramatic figure in Panhala suggests very well what Shivaji came to stand for. It's a modern statue of one of the generals who fought with him against Aurangzeb, but its spirit of bravado, like something from a child's book of legends, is exactly in keeping with Shivaji's own image. He came to seem almost like Robin Hood, mercilessly teasing and baiting the much more powerful Moguls in exploits which were often positively cheeky. Once he and his men cut a hole in the outer fence of a Moghul camp and made their way right to its center, in among the general's harem, killing many of his attendants before slipping away again. On another occasion, he himself escaped from Moghul captivity by being carried out hidden in a large basket of cakes and sweets. This romantic character had died the year before Aurangzeb's son rebelled, and the young prince came down to these regions to join forces with Shivaji's son. Aurangzeb decided to pursue him south, to punish this impertinent alliance. It was to be a turning point, not only in the reign, but even in the history of the entire Moghul Empire itself.
Aurangzeb was already 62. He would grow old campaigning in the south, trying to subdue this turbulent region long after his son Akbar had thought better of it and slipped away to Persia. The heartland of the Moghul Empire had long been this area. Aurangzeb would add vast territories to the south, and in the last 27 years of his life he never once set foot outside this area, representing a drastic change of policy. With this move south, the center of gravity of the Moghul Empire shifted. The places connected with Aurangzeb are all down here. Aurangabad, the city named after himself, which he virtually made his capital. The numerous Hindu forts which he constantly tried to wrest from the followers of Shivaji, such as Panhala. And the capital cities of the two great southern Muslim kingdoms which he was determined to conquer, Hyderabad and Bijapur. Both had held out against his ancestors. Both, to his great pride, would fall to him, Bijapur after a long siege in 1686. And at Hyderabad, the next year, he captured the greatest fort of all. But his men finally got inside these defences not by force of arms, but by bribery. Money would increasingly become the only way his sieges were brought to a successful end. Through this countryside, Aurangzeb would move back and forth with 500,000 people, his army and camp followers. But however far they marched, and however many forts they took possession of, the situation somehow never seemed to get any better.
This hilltop fort of Panhala is typical of the frustrations of Aurangzeb's last years. Soldiering on well into his 80s, he was like an old bear plagued by bees. He would take a fort and fill it with his soldiers, and then as soon as he'd moved on, the enemy would take it back again. He'd first captured this one in 1691, And now, 10 years later, here he was, back again, trying to capture it once more. And it's at that moment that we have an unexpectedly vivid picture of the stubborn old man. Most improbably, at this place, miles from anywhere, a British ambassador arrived from the court of William III, hoping to open up trade. He found chaos, a vast, insanitary camp, deep in mud, with despair and corruption and drunkenness among the troops. The shining exception was Aurangzeb himself, now aged 82. The ambassador describes him passing through the camp to visit the siege works.
He was all white, robe, turban, beard. He was carried through the crowd on an open litter, but he never once looked up from the book he was reading, undoubtedly the Quran. As another European visitor wrote, he had by now a craze for being held a saint. He was 89 when he finally died, and he died as he had hoped, on a Friday, the Muslim holy day, just after saying his prayers. This building, a few miles from Agra, is an example of how affairs at the centre of empire had gone from bad to worse during Aurangzeb's long absence. It is the tomb of his great-grandfather Akbar, a holy place indeed for the family. Yet this tomb was now pillaged by the local population. Its gold and silver plate was removed, and its rich carpets. It was just one example of the anarchy which would destroy the empire towards the end of Aurangzeb's reign and after his death. Aurangzeb's own grave could hardly provide a greater contrast. It's in the south, 15 miles from Aurangabad at Kuldabad. No great gateways and gardens and terraces here, just small whitewashed courtyards leading to a flight of 3 steps.
This is all that Aurangzeb's tomb consists of. A space the size of a small room and a bare patch of earth open to the sky. Exactly in keeping with what the Quran specifies and with his own image that he had always liked to project, that of a simple Muslim, just one of life's pilgrims. But in another way, this cramped space symbolizes the poverty of mind he had brought to the more generous tradition of his ancestors. With their flamboyant ability to enlist everyone's talents, Hindus and Muslims alike, in their cause, an idea which had once amply justified that resounding phrase, the Great Moghuls. This grave fulfills a very precise religious requirement, but it was very different from what India had come to expect of her emperors. The 6th Great Moghul was dead, and the empire dead with him.
Many of the later Indian princes were descended from men who grabbed parts of the Moghul Empire after Aurangzeb's death. It was in the resulting chaos that the British stepped in, just as the Moguls had 3 centuries earlier. Aurangzeb's descendants were still officially emperors, though increasingly powerless, until at last the imperial title was transferred to Queen Victoria. The British Raj certainly had its own moments of splendour, in a tradition of pomp and ceremony which continued right up to the end of empire in 1947. But it would be hard to maintain that any rulers of India, before or since, have ever shown quite the flair and the style of the Great Moguls.